really hoping to make, all right, we'll wait for the announcement to come. We're really hoping to make this an interactive session. So even as we go, if you have questions, you can either come off mute and interrupt us or raise your hand, and Amber and Kayla will be on the lookout to kind of pause us so that you can get your questions in. So by any means, I know there's more question time at the end, but if something we say triggers something and you want to ask a question, please feel free to jump right in, and love to hear from you and try to address all the questions we can. So Emily, I will pass it over to you now.
Thanks, Brooke. So obviously a big part of 6.1 is around the development of our processes. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about our continuous improvement cycle. This is really what we use within the BPM program to develop and improve our processes. So it starts with the design phase. This, I should back up and also say we get this framework from APQC. Design phase is really about developing our SIPOCs for processes, figuring out what are the suppliers, what are the outputs, what are the customers, what is the objective of the process. That second piece, develop, is where we do the process mapping. We use a program called BlueWorks Live. We've used it for quite a long time. We really like it. If you guys are interested in learning more about BlueWorks Live, I'm happy to share a little bit about that. Deployment, this is where we publish the maps. So we want to make sure that we've got a draft folder of maps where folks are able to sort of play around a little bit and experiment with different potential process maps, but we want to make sure that there's also a published folder where folks across the organization are able to access information that's validated by stakeholders. So that's that deployment phase. Once it's deployed, once it's published, the next phase for our processes is monitoring. I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation, but that's really making sure that we're able to measure the success of the process, that we have valid success measures, that we have baselines, that we have targets, that somebody's monitoring on a regular basis. And then the last phase of our continuous improvement cycle is improving. Another area that I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the presentation later, but we really take a Lean Six Sigma approach. We hold sort of modified Kaizen events to reduce process waste and to make sure that handoffs are smooth. And that's always continuously happening. So we have a regular review cycle for all of our processes, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment as well. As far as our key processes go, the way that we define them today is as our value stream processes. So we have 4 major value streams of Elevations. That's our lending, our mortgage lending processes, our consumer lending processes, business, banking, and commercial are sort of associated. We consider those to be part of one value stream. And then our move and manage money value stream. So the way that that's defined is that they provide direct value to our member. And what I have here is a graphic that shows you what our standard value stream funnel looks like. Sort of the phases. The only value stream we have that doesn't really fit this model very clearly is that move and manage money. But all of our lending really follows this value stream funnel from the external environment, where we're looking at competitor analysis, to the development of products and services, lead generation, so that's really around marketing, then sales, fulfillment, which includes underwriting, risk evaluations, loan decisioning, and then relationship management is really that ongoing management of that product or service. It definitely loops back from relationship management to some of these other steps as well. It's not linear. That's actually quite cyclical as well. Let's see. We also have our supporting processes. So like I said, these are our key processes. Our supporting processes are those processes within the organization that support these value stream processes. So I mentioned this to you a little bit. Key processes, this is really all of our value stream work highlighted in green. The supporting processes down below are in blue. And so we're actually doing some work to update this process map. This was developed with APQC as well. Go to the next page, which is the American Productivity and Quality Center. That was back in 2014. So we've made small adjustments to this map over the years, but in 2022, we're going to be sort of overhauling that value stream section to be a little bit more visually representative of that funnel that I showed you. And so as you can see here, all the text, these points below, those are our process categories. And that's also what we base our taxonomy on for all of our knowledge assets and for our business intelligence dashboards. So it really helps us sort of figure out where process ownership exists to align some of the decision making around these processes. So we wanted to highlight a couple of those supporting process areas that I mentioned on that previous slide. The ones we wanted to highlight for you are information security and project management. I'll pass it over to Brooke.
Perfect. Thank you, Emily. So again, managing information technology is one of the supporting processes. And so what I wanted to point out is when we were looking at kind of how we get started in IT and really throughout our organization, as you can see, Emily referred to is it APOC, APQC?
APQC.
APQC. I knew I'd get it wrong. I even tried. We turn to best practice frameworks. And the reason why is because there's no need for us to reinvent the wheel or kind of start from scratch. So it's a best practice guiding standard, it's reusable, repeatable, and they're free frameworks. So from an IT standpoint, we really look to COBIT and ITIL for our frameworks, which is COBIT is kind of the governance, ITIL is the service delivery for how we do things. And then from a project management standpoint, we became kind of agile and Scrum, and that was going to be our framework. So one of the benefits to kind of turning to a framework for how to get started is they're widely recognized. They're kind of proven tools that you can find training on them and resources. So you're really picking up where other people have already learned from, and they're not prescriptive, and so they kind of provide you that framework for how you can get started, which is great, and it gets everyone speaking a common language. And when you're looking to hire people, it's not something that's proprietary to Elevation. So there is a lot of benefits to kind of looking to a framework to help you get started. They also are adaptive and let you kind of then put for us, the Elevation's flair on things. So from a project standpoint, I'm actually going to start at the bottom of my slide and work my way up. So from project management, in 2018, we really wanted to get better at delivery. I don't know what organization doesn't want to do more with less resources faster. Always seems to be kind of the common thread. So we were trying to figure out how we enhance kind of our delivery of initiatives. And so we turned to Scrum, which is typically you have Scrum teams in software development organizations where they're developing all their own software. We don't develop our own software here at Elevations, but we found a lot of synergies in being able to have these dedicated teams kind of focused on delivering different types of work. So transitioning from our old waterfall project methodology to Scrum, it wasn't an overnight process. There was a lot of lessons learned along the way. For a period of time, it was called Scrum Fall because we were hopeful trying to make the transition, but still kind of learning new behaviors. And then also, I wanted to kind of highlight when we started, we created these teams. And so we, kind of, hey, let's just have these teams do work and we'll assign different chunks of work to these teams. Well, there was no rhyme or reason behind how these teams functioned or what kind of their bigger objective was. It was just a mishmash, hodgepodge of different projects that needed to be done. And as Emily was pointing out in her enterprise map, the value streams, what we ended up doing, I believe it was in probably 2018 or 2019, is we aligned the delivery teams to line up with those value streams. So now we have a mortgage delivery team. We have a move and manage money delivery team. And what it allows those teams to do is, don't know if this is the right term, but like operate towards a higher purpose. So kind of the goals and objectives of the move and manage channel and what that group is trying to accomplish really becomes the passion and the project that is driving the delivery team to execute things to enable that. So I think that's really been a powerful factor, is when we kind of aligned those delivery teams to a higher purpose, and not just kind of a hodgepodge of projects.
Yeah, it allows folks to specialize a little bit more and stay really strategically focused, I think.
Yeah. Our team composition for those value streams is we do have, they have a developer, which is either a full stack or our core system developer. They have systems analysts, which are on the technology side. They also have business analysts that report up through our ETG group. So they kind of get both sides of the sandwich there. They got someone kind of from the technology system side, and then also always looking at the business side, requirements, the process. They have a QA, so someone doing all the testing, and then also a Scrum Master. So it's kind of the general. Some teams are a little, might have 2 developers, might be slightly different in composition, but the core team, the disciplines you'll find on each team, those are really the core, what you'll find. Let's see. Go ahead,
Do you
Emily.
mind if I mention too, one of the cool things I think about the Scrum teams right now is those business analysts do sit on the business process management team, and so they have a strong process orientation. And so when projects are about to be worked on by the Scrum team, those business analysts are helping to make sure those processes are streamlined before they go to the technology group, so that we're not building technology on bad process.
Yeah, that is a nice to always have your process figured out before you throw on technology to solve problems. Each team, we have several different teams, has a different level of maturity. And I think that comes in any organization, but it's fun to watch them as they start to hit their rhythm. And when you kind of have the reporting and we can see the output of each project, we're really able to see the different velocity that the teams can do and what they're capable of. So that's been really great.
Brooke, we had a question, if I can interrupt you for a
Oh,
moment.
yeah, please do.
Natalie Shaw asks, where do product owners fall in the mix? Do you have to add staff to support Scrum teams?
Great question. I totally forgot about the product owner in my role. So each value stream does have a product owner. The product owner, and Emily, correct me, I'm doing a quick summary. They're all in the business. So the product owner for our lending team is our VP of lending. So she's very close to the business objectives. So we did not add any new staff for the product owner role. It really became part of the leader of that group to act as the product owner. And then they're only partially involved with the daily activities of the delivery teams, but they are obviously actively involved in the prioritization of their work. And then as far as was the second part, do we have to add staff for the delivery teams?
Yes, did we have to add staff to support Scrum teams?
We did. When we went to kind of the dedicated teams, we had to find the holes, and it wasn't like we implemented these teams all at once. It definitely was an evolution of finding, I think we started with 1 or 2 teams, and for a while we had split resources. So you'll serve on this delivery team for 50% of your time, and then just keep doing your work how we've traditionally done it the other 50% of the time. I can speak from that lesson learned is we really found, like, with your resources, you have to jump in and you have to dedicate them to that team, because when they're split between maybe multiple groups, or I'm going to call it like their day job and the team, it becomes very conflictive for them. What you can do, and Scrum really accepts, is like there's kind of just a portion of your work. So you almost have like ongoing stories that allows for some of that. For IT, we have a lot of incidents come up that they might need to jump in and help with. So we just kind of have some stories that cross the band there to account for our resources and allocates time that way. But we don't split people between different teams or multiple teams. It really is best when they're kind of focused on this is their team. They know who their product owner is and their Scrum Master. Otherwise, we find it places a really big burden on them, and they end up not knowing what is expected of them at work, which is one of our Gallup Q12 questions that we look at and monitor. And so we found that causes kind of more confusion than it's worth. So with Agile and project management, we've adopted and really the principles that have worked for us. So the teams aligned against the organizational goals and objectives, that was a big lesson learned. We've also been able to centralize our intake process. That was probably one of my favorite accomplishments in the last several years that I've been here, is just pushing and getting everybody in the organization to have one intake process. Otherwise, you've got emails going to this person and requests going this way. So it's been great helping us build our discipline. And all the teams are working in a similar fashion, even though the teams have different levels of maturity. Kind of everyone starts speaking the same language over time and kind of know what to expect. So we've really learned a lot from the project management side. For information technology, I'm going to jump over to that one really quick. So we use COBIT and ITIL. So both frameworks really complement each other. Most important, they incorporate a cycle of learning, which is also what you'll find in, Scrum. It's always about iterative approaches. Emily touched on it before with cycles of learning and the whole ADLI approach. So approach, deploy, learn, integrate. COBIT and ITIL both really encompass that. COBIT is our IT governance. So it's about ensuring the technology is being used or secure and support the business in the best way possible. It also really drives the alignment and integration between IT strategy and business strategy, that, IT really aligns with the business strategy. So that's some of the framework you got from COBIT. ITIL is kind of the way we do things, the day-to-day work, how we deploy services. So those have been great. And then I just wanted to, another lesson learned is, like with COBIT, one thing, I think Jerry was talking about it early, we rely on kind of partners to help us. And so COBIT is about setting up controls to make sure kind of your IT is functioning securely and efficiently. And so a few years ago, we reached out to a third-party partner to come in and do an assessment for us and help us define what our controls should be, and then kind of measure us against them. And so we didn't score perfectly in every model, but what we walked away with that from is kind of a baseline of where we were today. And from that, we've established a go to green strategy around our IT controls, which is really kind of how are we going to improve over time? And then where we'll go from that is in a few years, hopefully we'll have almost all greens on all of our controls saying, hey, we're performing optimally. And we'll reassess ourselves, because it's always about kind of raising the bar and taking on more, and just kind of always looking ahead and being forward thinking. So nothing is ever stagnant at Elevations. It's always moving. Emily, you can jump to the next slide. So again, A little bit more on ITIL. So this is our information technology infrastructure library. So it's our best practice framework for aligning IT service management with the organization. So it's a roadmap of exactly what we should be doing, employees in their everyday work. So for IT, this ITIL really helped us identify what processes we should have so that we can execute our work in a repeatable and predictable way. So I know this is a bit of an eye chart. This is the ITIL library. So I think there's 26 different topics that they recommend that you have processes for. So I'll just pick on two that I think everyone can relate to. So the first one is availability management. So that's really about your systems availability. It's identifying your critical systems and vendors, which kind of jumps over into Kayla's world with vendor management, making sure that our service level agreements are appropriate and prioritized so that we know what's most important. And as we've all lived through the pandemic, it really shifted to incorporate it's not just about availability of systems while we're working, here in the building. It became we need all employees to be available and able to work remotely. So that kind of changes our VPN requirements and different other processes that all tie together to kind of look at our overall systems availability. Was there another question pop up?
It's a confirmation that our agile teams are value stream based and not technology based.
Oh, okay. Yeah. They are value stream based. We do have a technology Scrum team that does more of the planned maintenance. So kind of the boring, not sexy work that nobody wants to ever do. So we do have a IT delivery team that really focuses on kind of systems upgrade and keeping the systems open. So, but they still operate in the Scrum structure. The other process I was going to highlight is incident management. So it's really how we respond when things go wrong. Its process is very basic of how do users engage with us? How do they, if all of us on their computer or they need a Zoom and it's not working. So the rules of engagement, how do they reach out to us? What are our turn times? What can they expect from us? And also from IT's perspective, when somebody does reach out to us, how do we know how to prioritize their incident? So kind of is Brooke being locked out of her computer as impactful as something else? And so our incident management processes have prioritizations and tables that kind of really guide people on how to determine the level of impact and the response timeline required for different things. That's all I had, Emily. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Brooke. So I wanted to talk to you all a little bit more about the process monitoring phase. So you probably remember this graphic from the cycle of continuous improvement that I showed you earlier. What does process monitoring really mean? So what we do is we have, I think, about 600 published processes in our published library. And for each of those, in order for them to get to that next phase, that monitoring phase, they need to have a metric definition, a target. They have to have identified who's monitoring, a monitoring method. Sorry, just one moment.
I'll actually take advantage of your pause, Emily, because there was one more question related to Scrum that Natalie had, was actually asking how many Scrum teams do we have?
I was counting those in my head. Do we have 6, Emily? Is there?
Move and manage money, consumer lending, and business banking is actually grouped together because they don't have as many projects as some of the others. Mortgages, IT, ITAD, systems engineering.
Digital. Yeah.
5.
Thank you.
We're terrible counters.
Yes, 5. Yeah.
Perfect.
So in terms of the process monitoring, the other pieces that they need to have in order to be qualified in this phase is a response plan, which means they need to identify what's the trigger. If something, when do we consider this process to be underperforming? So what's that trigger? And then what's the response plan? What actions need to be taken if this particular process is underperforming? And so we have a dashboard that shows for all of those processes what phases they're in to sort of help incentivize folks to sort of get into that next phase of the process. Our business intelligence team manages hundreds of dashboards for our organization. And so we're trying as best we can to link all of our processes to those BITE dashboards, those business intelligence dashboards. We recognize that not every process is going to have a dashboard. In some cases, things are monitored in a manual way, and there's no way around that in some cases. Do you want to talk a little bit too about the SLAs, Brooke?
Yeah, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier. So really with the SLAs, what I wanted to point out here is we're also, as we continually improve, raising the bar on ourselves. So you can see here, we had a target SLA of 3 nines for our systems availability. And after doing some market research and even looking at how we had been performing, we internally raised the bar on what was expected and what our target SLA was. So again, I always think it's about, you have to kind of start somewhere so that you're able to measure and then always be looking at how you can improve. So although we thought we were doing great, when we went out and kind of looked at how are we really doing against our peers, you raise the SLA on yourself and you kind of just continually raise the bar. That's all I had on that, Emily.
Thank you, Brooke. The other process, continuous improvement phase that I wanted to talk a little bit about is improving. So it's really interesting. Brooke talked a lot about how we've matured and sort of iterating and those cycles of learning. In the past, as an organization, we've been really good at documenting processes. We, like I said, have over 600 processes published. That was sort of our yardstick, our success measure was sort of the number of processes that we were going to publish. And as we're maturing as an organization, we're really coming to understand that these two phases, monitoring and improvement, haven't really been the focus. And so right now, we're really trying to focus on those two areas. We've got all these processes, and we're reviewing them on an annual basis for accuracy, but we haven't been reviewing them on a regular basis for improvement. So this is sort of a new change for us. To the extent that we can, we're really trying to also string some of these processes together. Right now, we have a lot of processes that are sort of small and contained, and we're looking to string those together into more end-to-end experiences. And so a couple of the improvement workshops that we've recently done have associated with some of our larger processes, excuse me, have been for mortgage lending and on error reporting. So for mortgage lending, that's taking it all the way from sales and through the relationship management, the issuing of the loan. Previously, we had sales had their process, processing had their process, underwriting had their process, etc. And so we've strung those together. And then we did that workshop. During that workshop, we worked to identify where there's process waste and eliminating that. Another huge part of that was getting really, really clear on handoffs. Because that process wasn't strung together in the past, there was a lot of inconsistencies between what happened when a process shifted to the next group. And so we worked extensively with them to establish clear SLAs, clear handoff checklists that are agreed upon by the whole group. So that was a really fun one to get into. The next one is error reporting. So Carrie Barjett, who's on the call today, has been working tirelessly to improve our error reporting, which is really exciting because we've had error reporting for a long time, but if you don't categorize things carefully, sometimes you end up with data that's not very meaningful. And so what we've been doing is seeking to get consistency in the way that our errors are cataloged, establishing really clear criteria for different criticality levels for those errors. Because if you have really clear data on error reporting, it's so easy to see which processes aren't working. So you can see which ones you need to focus on for improvement. But without that good data, it's not meaningful. And so that's been a really cool project that we've been working towards as well. So I mentioned this earlier. We really base our improvement efforts on Lean Six Sigma best practices. Brooke talked already about how important it is to really look to these best practice methodologies so that we're speaking the same language, so that we're not starting from ground zero. And I say modified Kaizen events because for those of you who are familiar with Lean Six Sigma, you can have Kaizen events that go on for 2 weeks, and we just don't have the capacity to be able to do that in an organization of our size. And so we try to keep it to 1 to 3 days, depending on the size of the process and the number of stakeholders involved. But we bring together stakeholders from across that process. So definitely including someone within each role who's involved in delivering that process, but also customers of the process, people who are adjacent to the process, to make sure that we're getting all the different perspectives on what's going well and what we can improve.
We did have a great question real quick, Emily, if you're at a pausing point that makes sense. Matt Jefferson did ask, do we do any journey mapping?
Do we do journey mapping? We do, yes, we do journey mapping as well. We've recently been working, one of the ones that I have facilitated recently has been, we were journey mapping the most common calls we're getting in the contact center. So as things have become more digital, since the pandemic has happened, we certainly have had higher volumes in our contact center. So it's become increasingly important that we're streamlining those. And so one of the big ones we've done is wire transfers, when we get calls for wire transfers. And so we've brought together a ton of folks from the contact center, leadership in different areas, our operations folks, to figure out what are the ways that we can make that experience better for the member. And we're actually working on some changes that are expected to reduce the time a member might wait for a wire by an entire day. Because previously, the contact center representative would have to open a ticket that would go to an operations person who would develop a DocuSign form that would send it to the member would send it back. And so now we've eliminated a lot of that by just allowing that contact center representative to be able to fill out and send that DocuSign form. So it's really reducing the time it's taking for our members to get what we need. So journey mapping has definitely been really central to a lot of our process improvements. Great question. We're also looking to put a lot of these process improvement tools in the hands of our employees by developing and rolling out a continuous improvement toolkit. So we've put together these colorful worksheets that help facilitate folks through certain activities, like root cause analysis, like identifying the voice of the customer, even how to run some of these process improvement workshops. My team, our business process management team, is facilitating those workshops, but as we do more and more of them, we're looking to train staff throughout the organization on how to facilitate those themselves, sort of a train the trainer, so that we can see more of this going forward. One of the cycles of learning I wanted to touch on too is, I mentioned before that we have 600 process maps and all of them are expected to be reviewed annually by all stakeholders. And you can imagine, like, that is a huge time commitment. And it's really difficult for us to really pay good attention to all of them, right? And so one of the things that we're currently in the process of doing is developing criteria to better rate the criticality of our different processes. And for those that are more critical to our business, being able to make sure that every year we have those facilitated workshops for those to make sure that not only are they correct, but where can we eliminate process waste, where can we improve handoffs, that kind of thing. When everything is important, nothing is important. So when you have 600 process maps that are all very much considered the same level of importance, it's difficult to make sure that the things that really matter are getting improved. The other thing we're doing that's kind of new is starting to make sure that we have review cycles for our business rules. A big part of good process is making sure that there's clear business rules, and that's something that we haven't governed a lot in the past, and now we're asking folks to keep those on a review cycle. Questions about that? About any of that improvement information? Or monitoring? I see a raised hand. Ryan?
It's easier to ask than to type. Quick question about the Lean Six Sigma. Who's certified to what level? Do you guys have certifications for Lean Six Sigma in your organization?
Great question. So several of my team members and myself are all black belt certified. Those of us who are facilitating those sessions are black belt, have our black belt certification. We've also offered for a number of years, we've supported folks throughout the organization getting their green and yellow belts. Certainly white belts, there's like a free white belt out there that you can get. But depending on folks' level of effort with some of these process activities, we've offered them free yellow and green belts.
How many people do you have on your team or that are black belt certified?
4. 4 black belt certified.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions about this? Okay. Let me see a chat. How do you define business roles? That's a great question. Something that we're kind of working through right now, but what we've found is that for a lot of these processes, business rules have been established to say if then if this then that, right? And so that's kind of what we mean by the business rules is when faced with certain decision points, what are you selecting? Still working on the defining of that. Do you do any journey mapping with members? That's a great question. We don't today. That would be something that would be really cool to do. I'd be interested to know if anybody on the call today does journey mapping with their customers. Anybody? No? We have what's called, oh, Nick. Yeah, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I don't know if it, oh, you can see. I mean, a little bit, we do like focus groups, right? And we pull in all that voice into while we're doing the journey mapping. So sometime beforehand, we'll set up interview guides and get a team of people together to go out in the community and interview members, non-members, competitor members, and then bring that back in. And so that's also, we kind of use that both that process for design thinking and member journey mapping.
That's really cool. How long have you guys been doing that?
Probably like 3 or 4 years, but it's sporadic. We don't have those projects all the time, so yeah. It's maybe like a handful of projects we've done that on.
That's great. Yeah, that'll definitely be a note that I take today. Appreciate that question. One of the other things that we're looking to mature, I mentioned earlier as part of that monitoring phase, trying to tie our process maps, our 600 process maps, to all of these business intelligence dashboards we have. It's interesting because we have a ton of both, but they haven't traditionally been tied together very closely. And so we're really trying to marry those things and say, we have all these dashboards, but what processes are they actually measuring? The other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was integrating our BPM methodology into the rest of the organization. So a couple of the ways that we do that, we have BPM training for all leaders. There's actually the next series of events today. One of those is a deep dive into our BPM program. So you'll learn a little bit more about that if you're interested. And so we have BPM basics and advanced. So it goes through each of those sort of sections of that cycle. BPM basics focuses on that design, develop, deploy. So through publication of process, and then advanced talks about monitoring and improving. And then the other thing that I think is really meaningful that we have here is special forces. So what special forces is it's a group of 60 individuals, give or take, that represent each of the categories on that category map. And they're responsible for making sure that we have processes documented, that those are reviewed on that annual cycle, that our knowledge assets that are associated with those processes are up to date. So those are procedures, quick start guides, that kind of thing. And then our training team trains based on those knowledge assets. So it's really critical that those things all stay up to date. And so the Special Forces group is really a meaningful part of the way that we integrate BPM into our organization. The Special Forces, we have two roles within Special Forces. One is a documentation specialist and one is a process improvement specialist. And some folks perform both roles. Some folks are in small departments, and so they represent both. Actually, we have quite a few of those folks. The documentation specialists are really focused on making sure that those knowledge assets are up to date, including the procedures. And then process improvement specialists are, we've made some changes to their roles recently. We're really trying to make sure that they feel empowered to be able to do some of this process improvement facilitation within their own departments. Questions about this? Thoughts on it? Be interested to know if anybody else, oh, I see a raised hand. Hi, Nick.
Hi, again. We very much have piggybacked off a lot of your guys' best practices over the years, since you guys, first award in 2014. So, we have enterprise process map. We have, we call them SOAR teams, special operations achieving results, right? There's just so much, but we, part of this is like the evolution. Right. I mean, we have like one person overseeing BPM and we train all these other cross-functional team members to, do some of this work and to facilitate. But I'm just curious as far as, as you've grown, you've had to grow employees, right? Well, we're much smaller a credit union and as far as employee size. So developing the capacity to do all these things over time, right? How has that kind of evolved for you? I guess it's broad, but
it's a challenge. Honestly, it's a real challenge because it's one of those things where everybody has their day jobs too, right? And so to the extent that we can, we just are trying to be really clear about what the resource requests are. We're asking folks for, an hour a week of their time to be able to devote to these things. In cases where they have more to do than they have time for, we're trying to get more special forces within their areas to be able to join, to share that responsibility. The other thing that we are working to do a little bit more is get process owners to be more engaged and feel more accountable. I think that's been one of the challenges that we've had in the past is a lot of the burden of this is falling on those special forces folks. But we really need to make sure that these process owners are feeling like it's their responsibility to make these improvements too.
Yeah, that's thanks for that. Yeah, I think we struggle for the same thing. So it's nice to hear, other people have been in the boat, right? As far as that buy-in and stuff goes, have you, that's like you said, has it been sometimes a struggle from the process owner standpoint?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Sometimes people think of processes separate from what they do. They think that this an additional thing, but it is what you do, right? It's about how you do the things that you do. It's about how you do your job. And so the more that we can help folks across the organization really understand that, I think that's helping to break down the walls. But I think it's hard for people to see that sometimes if it's not the way that they've been asked to think in the past.
Nick, I'll even tack on a little bit. I think some of the training programs, I think it was this year, maybe it was last year, that we kind of added the requirement for all managers in the organization to go through the BPM Advanced and BPM Basics. So really kind of, I think it's a skill. Like, I'm not natural at writing process. I mean, it can be overwhelming. And so kind of teaching people the discipline so that, kind of like anything, it's muscle memory, it becomes more comfortable with it. And so I think the training programs have also been a helpful component of just kind of teaching people how to do it and not expecting that people should just, although it is what we do every day, writing that down is not so easy. And if you're like me, sometimes when you're looking at process, you want to start going crazy with like how you want the process to be, or like, oh, well, I see waste here, so I should not only work on documenting the process, but I should improve it while I'm doing this. And I have quickly learned that sometimes the first step is just documenting what we do, and then turning to Emily and her team who are more skilled at this, at helping, even me walk through the steps to like, how do I iteratively now improve this? Because I tend to bite off when I'm doing process improvement more than I can chew. And it's like, help me rein this in and do it right. So, but I think the training is key. Kind of the more you can help teach people how to write process and how to keep it simple is awesome.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. You got me on that point on, we always get stuck in the design. Like, we want to redesign this process as we're like doing the work just to document it. And so, yeah, it's good to pull ourselves back. I think, thank you for that.
Yeah, I just did one. We walked through in IT incident management. It's a big, huge process. And I worked with Carrie, who's on Emily's team and our team, kind of walking through. And can I say part of it was just invigorating for us to just even create the process map. And we have like big red boxes now where it's like, ooh, gap, red box that. And at least then we can you all kind of walk away from the meeting being like, yep, we all agree on where the holes are. But we're not going to fix all those holes today. Like, which is the biggest hole we need to fix? But we all know this process isn't perfect. But the most important thing is that we're all doing incident management in the same way. So we have to like make small incremental improvements.
Always iterating. Like, I think that's like the most important lesson I've learned from all of this too, is like when we've tried to boil the ocean on things, it just kind of falls apart. And so being willing to just kind of take things slowly, and that helps the change management too, right? Like, taking things really slowly allows for people to get used to a little bit of the change and then move forward a little bit. So that's been a good way too.
We had another question. We were asked if we could expand on process owners, how many and at what level do we have them?
Yeah. So every process has a process owner. And so, as I mentioned, we've got 600 processes. Obviously, there's several folks that are owners for many different processes. But I also mentioned we're trying to combine some of these smaller processes into larger end-to-end. And so as we do that, we're going to see less folks with that role of process owner. But I'll give you an example. Up until recently, I oversaw the the project intake process for the organization. And so I was the process owner for project intake. And so it was really my responsibility to figure out what's not working, to take feedback from my customers, my internal customers, to reduce that process waste, to make sure the communication is clear. So that's really what we mean by process owner. It's the person who's accountable for making sure that that process is successful. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Are the process owners always at a certain level in the organization, Emily?
Not necessarily. So I think there, sometimes folks will classify process owners as being someone who's a people leader, but I don't think that that's necessary at all. I'll give you an example. There's, one of the things Carrie, who we've checked that on my team, has done is she for a long time she had a Special Forces newsletter, and she was completely responsible for making sure that that got completed. Amber was a huge part of that too. Carrie was the process owner for that, and she was isn't in a manager position, but it depends on the scope of the project, right? I know in Carrie and Amy are leading the business process management training, and they talk about, everyone's a process owner. You're a process owner for the process of brushing your teeth in the morning, so anything that's done can have a process owner at any level.
And Ryan, do you want to jump in with your comment or question?
It was asked and answered in the chat. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, Emily, unless you have anything else, that is the end of our presentation. So we're going to open it up for questions. I have a few questions that came in from the questions that everyone submitted during the registration process. So fortunately, they're all directed towards Emily. So unless someone, and feel free to come off mute at any time, otherwise I'll just start. So Emily, how do you overcome pushback during implementing processes?
That is such a good question. So when we implement processes, that's to say when we're making changes to a process, a big part of that needs to be communication planning, right? So I did also mention that when a process changes, their corresponding knowledge assets, including procedures, need to be updated as well, because that's what the training team bases their trainings on. So that's a component of it. We also, like I said, need to have communication plans to communicate those changes. So identifying who is going to be impacted by this change, and then what kind of messaging do they need. Amber, who is also on the call, is actually in charge of our change management program, our organizational change management program. So she helps to provide resources to assess the impact of change, so that folks who are responsible for communicating those things have some guidance there.
Perfect, thank you.
This is a great question. How do you help employees distinguish between project work and BPM process work?
It's a good question. There's a lot of overlap, which is a good thing. It's a very good thing. And I think we're actually tying those things together more and more. So I mentioned earlier that the business analysts now who sit on those project teams are in part responsible for, before it gets to the technical team, making sure that the process is sound. And so it's actually the BPM continuous improvement model is built into that project delivery model in a lot of ways. We're actually also looking at combining intake with our project intake and our BPM intake. And what I mean by that is currently we have, I think, a really strong centralized project intake for all of our technical projects, which Brooke alluded to earlier. However, we have a different process for intaking things within the BPM team if you want a process to be improved. But what we're finding so often is that folks will request a project because they think they need technology, and sometimes they don't need technology. Sometimes they need their process fixed. And so what we want to do is ask folks, what's the problem that you're having? Explain it to me. And then we will help you figure out whether or not you need a project team, a technical project team, or if you need process work, or if you need a business intelligence person to help you. We want to kind of make some changes in that way. Does that help?
It was helpful to me.
Oh, okay.
You got a
Good.
thumbs up.
The next question is, are processes created or validated in a project that's being done or after the fact?
Before. We always want to build technology on top of good process. So if there isn't an existing documented process for whatever that new technology change is associated with, my team is responsible for documenting and validating those process maps before the technology is built on top of it.
Perfect. Amber, do you want to take this next one?
Sure.
I feel like
So
it's
the
a great one
question,
for you.
so the question is, how do you manage / control the quantity or amount of changes so that frontline staff aren't overwhelmed each week by changes? So typically our changes tend to be broken up into enterprise level changes and then departmental changes, and then what impacts a member or a employee. So the first thing we want to do is we want to identify what level of change there is, and then we build those timelines backwards and establish a date of deployment. And we try to make it so that, yes, they're not overwhelmed, they're not getting too many communications. We are in, the year of 2022, so change is just in our fabric. It's what we do. So we do try and space those out, and we do take our changes in a level where we're going to address the enterprise changes first, and those have the longest timeline, and then we can whittle it down. So we know that departments can only, really handle the saturation of about 1 to 2 changes at a time. So we will break those up and work with those teams. And then anything that impacts our members or our frontline employees, we take those and really focus in on, is it going to be something that's a change in technology? Like instead of clicking this button, we click this button. We know that only needs a small change of communications plan versus this needs enterprise level training. So we do really try and take those kind of by level and then build that timeline backwards so we're not saturating their change. I don't know if that was helpful.
It is helpful. And I think one of the great things that Amber has established and brought to the organization is her group really becomes the center point for all the delivery teams to kind of run their changes through. And they even have a framework that can help the team determine kind of, well, we're going to deploy this change or this whole project, how big, like what types of communication. So not only is Amber and her team available for consultation, but they've created like nice kind of self-service forms that can help the team kind of learn, how do you gauge the level of change? So I think it's been great. And it's been great to be able to count on her to help with the change management. So coming from IT, I know sometimes that can be one of our hurdles, is good at getting it ready, and the deployment is always difficult. So.
Thanks, Brooke. We have a good question from Nick. How do you determine your capacity or resource limits for project or process work? I'm sure part of this is probably a good prioritization, but do you have work in progress limits or determine the stress of the organization?
God, this is such a good question.
It's very relevant.
This is very relevant, very timely. It's hard. So you're right, project prioritization is a huge part of it. We have quarterly business planning too, where we sort of check in on our project roadmaps and have business leaders come together and talk about certain dependencies and risks that we see across our project roadmaps for all of those teams. And so that's really how we're managing it today. But one of the things that we're looking forward to is we're actually in the process of switching our project management system. Currently, we're using a couple different systems. We've got like ServiceNow, we've got Jira, we've got DevOps, and so we're trying to move everything into DevOps and manage all of our work in one system. And we're hoping that that will help us better manage our resource management across the organization and sort of not be, if you're in a million different systems, it's really hard to be really clear on who's asking for what resources. One of the other things that we did this year, which was new, is we had this action plan playbook. So we have our one-year business plan, which highlights some of those most important actions we have for 2022, but then the action plan playbook broke that down even further. So it lists like at least 50 of our most important actions. It also includes, I think really importantly, who the major stakeholders are for that. So it's easier for us to see at the beginning of the year, okay, from a BPM perspective, my team is listed on 12 of these 50 actions. And so I know that Brooke is going to come to me because she's the action owner for that. She's going to come to me and ask for resources. So I need to prepare myself and connect with Brooke. But I think that we're working through being a little bit more systematic in the way that we do resource planning. It's a big challenge right now. Brooke, do you want to add to that?
Really from the IT perspective, one thing I could add is we definitely have, our value stream delivery teams are more mature. We have one IT team that is very mature in how they execute. And then we have our systems engineering group that hasn't been as mature or rigorous in kind of their framework and the way they're managing the work. And we've really kind of seen the struggles that it's caused. And so just kind of always reevaluating. And so we're looking in IT right now of how do we structure the teams better so that we are better managing. A lot of those roles are kind of single point of failure, right? We only have one systems engineer. We only have one enterprise architect. And so we have to somehow centralize the work or make it where we can figure out where those resources are being pulled. So this is an area that like we definitely, as Emily said, like we've made so much progress, and I know we need to celebrate our successes, but I think if you asked any of us, it's one of ours that we're looking forward to improving the most. So
follow-up question to that. Oh, sorry.
I was going to follow up, but you can go on to the next question if you want. Yeah, I'll ask in just a second.
I was just going to say they're asking, Lynn is asking, how does what you're describing right now link to capability and capacity planning? I can speak on Fridays, I promise.
Really, when when I look at that, it's when we're looking at the projects and evaluating them, not only do we have to kind of find out what skills we need, but also evaluating the capacity of the team. So a lot of times, that is used in determining what teamwork might go on. So we'll kind of look at the capabilities and skill sets within the team. We also are quick to resource outsource. If we need a specific skill set that we don't have in-house, like we will look outside to see how we can get some professional services to help us. So we have a pretty healthy professional services budget that we definitely need to tap onto. And the great part is with the right professional services partners, a lot of times then our teams can learn the skill set for the future. But we look for best practice frameworks, we look for professional services. We do not like to recreate the wheel, kind of call on the professionals when you can.
And the professional services thing, I think, is really important to think about because we're in a situation where, really strong technical resources are getting harder and harder to attract and retain. And so we're really looking to do that when we don't, otherwise it could take sometimes months to hire a really strong technical resource in certain ways. And so increasingly important for us is that outsourcing piece.
Nick, you're up.
Just kind of following up to this, of course, it's probably timely, but we're trying to do the same thing as far as resource, and so I think part of what we've discovered is, the quote, problem half defined is a problem half solved, right? Like we spend a lot more time now on discovery. So even before we get to DMAIC and define, we really do like a much more in-depth project discovery of resources and planning and having people calculate how many hours and per week and trying to do that based on that. And, we're working through kinks, but I'm curious to know, like as far as your kind of discovery of that project and that planning, how is that a whole kind of separate thing that you guys do?
It's evolving all the time. It's difficult. It's really difficult to do. That's one of the reasons we added business analysts to the team too, is to make sure that we have a resource dedicated to doing some of that ahead of time. Part of the challenge is very often there's discovery that we can't necessarily do until we start getting into the project. That's been one of the biggest challenges, I think, is there's just problems you don't know exist until you put the hood up, right? Brooke, do you want to speak to that too?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. And I think the only thing, kind of the direction we're evolving, and I mean, we're at the infancy, Nick, is kind of like, how do we identify the resources, identify, with that right amount of discovery, because you don't want to go too far down discovery and, spin duty cycles on a project that might be 18 months out. So kind of finding that balance, but being able to find out like kind of a WAG and the level of effort to get it good enough, but really know kind of what are the skill sets I need. What team would I send this to? Because then you can start to lay things out. One thing with Scrum is it's not so much like exactly how many hours per se, because as the team starts getting into it, that's when they'll start breaking the work up in the sprints. But you can kind of use that estimate. I always say to know how big your bar is on your graph, right? If you kind of have a roadmap out and you're like, well, I know it's complex and really hard, so we're just gonna have this long line. It gets visually much easier to know, like we have a lot of unknowns here. So I think there's a balance, and if we figure out the answer, because I'm hoping we do, Nick, and we got a better model, like I'd love to share it with you, but this is something, when I said it's relevant, like me and Emily are probably eyeballs deep in that, and just kind of how do we mature this and take it to the next level, because resources are scarce right now. Our teams are tired. Our list is long. I mean, we are great at great ideas. We are so good at great ideas.
Yeah. A couple of the things too that might be worth highlighting. We have, as part of our project intake today, we have a weekly, what we call pipeline disposition meeting, where we've got folks from across the organization, including a ton of IT folks, and all of the project requests that come in are reviewed with the requester presents their request, and we score it together as a group based on value and risk. And part of that risk criteria includes the project sizing. So the IT folks who are on the Scrum teams are included in that meeting so that they can help to score what they believe that initial sizing might be and what the initial complexity might be, and whether we have internal knowledge that exists today, and what are the resources that are prepared to be able to handle this kind of request. And so that's a big part of how we're doing it today. The other thing that's kind of interesting to note, just as a cycle of learning, is a couple of years ago, we tried having we realized there's so much discovery to do on all these projects that we tried having a discovery Scrum team. This team was entirely devoted to just doing discovery. And what we found was that was not working because all of that knowledge would be gained about the problem and it wouldn't go on. There's so many little pieces of information that you come to understand through discovery that couldn't really be passed on very easily to the people who are actually delivering the work. And so we found very clearly that didn't pan out. So those value stream groups, or the value stream delivery Scrum teams, are doing a lot of the discovery themselves.
And I think that's, Emily, you nailed it with like the discovery team wasn't the same as the delivery team. And that's also what I've found when you go too deep in the discovery up front. You know, technology changes so rapidly that sometimes the information you learned 8 months ago on a product, or, you know, answering all the questions on your project, changes and becomes irrelevant. So that is a challenge, that right balance to be able to make informed decisions and know where to take things. Yes, feedback paralysis. Is that your, Glenn, is that your concern with the disposition team? I'm curious. And the only reason I would say that is the disposition team is a great place, again, to kind of flesh out your idea. It does sometimes raise a lot of red flags, like too many questions or uncertainties about a project that someone might need to go back with. But I think it's a great place to get all thoughts on the table with different ideas that come through, and kind of everybody gets that 5,000 foot view of it. And the scoring model, and Emily, feel free to jump in at all, but I think the scoring model kind of alludes to like when there are a bunch of like feedback or questions, or like, hey, you didn't think about this, what about that? Kind of flushes out in the scoring of like, ooh, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot still to be worked out with this project. It kind of, the score balances that in the level of importance.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the things, our scoring criteria has, you know, evolved greatly all the time. We're always trying to make improvements to it. One of the things I like about it is you score a lot higher if you can, obviously, if you can quantify some of the returns that you're going to get for it. If you can't quantify it, you can still get some points if you know that it's going to produce some efficiencies or potential revenue, but quantifying it, you get more points. So.
I'll just say, in what I was talking, why that jumped out at me was when you were talking about the data that you get. If you're combing for data so often to the point that the data that you get may be outdated by the next day, you were making that point. And I guess that's my concern about this whole thing. We are just entering this process. We are just starting to have our core competencies meetings and those kinds of things. We are way at the beginning of this process. And I guess my big concern is this. I'm big into feedback models, and so I have a love for them, but there's also this fear that I have of we're going to start feedbacking on feedback on feedback, and then eventually you have to feed forward. Something has to happen. So feedback paralysis becomes, you know, a fear of mine, especially as we're a smaller organization, and as we're trying to negotiate what exactly is it we're trying to accomplish here. You know, and so, you know, the concept navel gazing sometimes comes to mind, and I just want to, you know, I heard you talking about, I got distracted for a minute, snap back in on your comment about getting data that is outmoded the minute you got it. So, you know, but yeah, that kind of feedback paralysis is something that I want to make sure we can avoid.
Yeah, and I would just encourage you as you're starting is really the small incremental steps. And sometimes step one is just documenting how something works today. Like, what is our today state, and not what we want it to be. Like, you can have those philosophical conversations all day long, right? But I remember when I started working in IT and we were documenting our software development lifecycle, and oh my gosh, I think I spun on that for I don't even want, it's embarrassing to tell you how long I spun on that, because we were just trying to get every group's every requirement, and it's like we just had to get a structure, like we had to get a skeleton. So yeah, teach your team how to be happy with not being perfect.
Fair enough.
Yeah, breaking things down into small pieces is so big too.
Any other questions? If not, I've got one more, but I'll wait a few seconds to see if there's any other that pop up.
Kirk.
I apologize. I was in a different session and I jumped over to this one. So you might have answered this already. You can totally shut me down. But we've talked about capacity. Can I ask, do you maintain any sort of ratios around how many analysts to how many employees in the company or how many projects? How do you know when you need more analysts? And if you can give us an idea of how many analysts you actually run?
Oh, we don't track that, but we've got for each of our value stream teams, we have a business analyst. I think it wouldn't hurt to have more, but we haven't done enough tracking or sort of data analysis to help show whether or not we need more resources. Good question though.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I see a question. I'm sorry, what is a disposition team? So a disposition team, what we have at Elevations, we'd call it our pipeline disposition group. And so it's just that group of folks that include primarily IT resources, but folks from different parts of the business who review those project requests and help to score it based on the value and the risk. Sure thing.
Perfect. All right, Emily. Let's see, one more question over to you. So operational efficiency and the essentials to getting started on an intentional path of improving operational efficiency.
So I suppose the role that operational efficiency plays in our BPM program and our continuous improvement cycle is really when we're focused on that improvement phase of processes, a big part of what we're focusing on is eliminating process waste. And so we walk through the different types of process waste with the participants of the workshop and ask them to look for opportunities to eliminate. The other really exciting thing that we're starting to do, and that I know a lot of you all are probably starting to do, is look for opportunities for more automation. There's increasingly more and more tools available to automate certain processes. And so to the extent that we can, we're exploring new tools for workflow automation, which is great because it also eliminates a lot of errors. It helps streamline communications. So that's another efficiency area we're focusing on.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, that is the end of the questions we have. So anyone have any final questions, or we'll just hang out here for a few minutes. So feel free to ask away.
All right. Well, feel free to email any of us too. We're happy to answer any questions. We like talking about this stuff, so certainly happy to chat anytime.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye.